Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures daily dose of nature. Our topic today, photography lessons for African safaris, presented by Dr. Court Whelan. And Court was born and raised in Florida, spent much of his much of his youth, I should say, outdoors, fostering a strong love and appreciation for nature and wildlife. And this fascination led him to attend the University of Florida, where he received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in both ecotourism and entomology. And even though he is from Florida, that's not where he is right now. He is coming to us from his home in Boulder, Colorado. And I am going to turn it over to Court and let him tell you a little bit more about himself and then right into the presentation. So welcome, Court.
Great. Thanks so much, Lee. Yeah, broadcasting here from Boulder, Colorado, and a somewhat snowy day. We got a pretty strong snowstorm over Easter, so it might look a little bit different than where you are tuning in from, wherever in the country you might be. Yeah, I'm an expedition leader here at Natural Habitat Adventures, a photo expedition leader as well. So I kind of turn any trip that I'm on to in some way into like a photographic expedition, because I think that everybody likes being able to return home with good photos, and Africa is certainly no exception. I like this topic because it is specific, it's region specific, but it also is really very applicable to all nature and wildlife photography. These things will be a little bit more tuned into Africa and the things that you're likely to see there, which I think is a great thing if you are dreaming of planning an African safari, if you might be headed on one soon, or at least later in the year. I think it's gonna be a really, really good tutorial here to get your mind set up on what are the challenges, what are the gear you might want to consider, and also what are the top techniques, what are the things you might pick up from other talks specific for Africa. We're going to distill them all down into one kind of bite-sized chunk here. That being said, I have done a couple other webinars in this series, Nature Photography 101 and 102, two separate ones. So if you haven't checked those out, be sure to check those out. I think they're going to be nice supplementary bits of information. I might refer to them, but again, this is a one-stop shop. The idea is to give you everything you need to know for heading to Africa on a photo safari to get some great photos, with a lot of great memories, but maybe even more photos. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. You will see on the screen here, I do intentionally have a very big cursor, a red arrow here, because I'm going to be pointing to some things on photos and talking about composition and leading lines and maybe why I chose to do this, this, and this. Kind of a fun interactive way to do so. So yeah, as I'm throwing around this cursor, I'm usually pointing to something that I want you to indeed focus on and some takeaway points from there. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So Africa, I mean, it might be the holy grail for nature and wildlife trips in general. We call a lot of things safaris here at Natural Habitat Adventures because safari is really a Swahili word for vacation, but it really has its origins in Africa, and there's no other place, there's no other feeling like being on an African safari. I often get the question, where is your favorite place in the world? So I guide all over, dozens of countries throughout the year. What's your favorite trip? And that's a great question. And I can't not have an African safari somewhere in my top 3 because it's just that awesome. So again, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Africa, it's big. There are some challenges here. So we're going to start off with a few challenges, but as you'll see throughout the presentation and by the end, these are all overcomable and you can actually use these challenges to your benefit in a lot of cases. So the first thing is Africa's big. It's big, vast landscapes. It's huge skies. Wildlife can often be far away. It can be shrouded in shrubbery and bushes. It can be close as well, like you'll see in a lot of these photos. But you're dealing with a lot of different factors involved in your photo expedition. In addition, you're mostly vehicle-based. For the vast majority of safaris, certainly photo safaris, you are vehicle-based. You might be bumping around a safari vehicle, scouting out for leopard tracks or looking for wild dogs, like in this case. You have to have your photo gear in a seat beside you. Now, there are different considerations with that. You have different confines. You can't just jump out of the vehicle and get the best angle. Not only is that not prudent for park restrictions, but it's just generally not safe to jump out of the vehicle. But continuing on, there's also other factors, like it's a pretty dry, arid, dusty landscape. What do you do about the dust that might emerge from cruising down a dusty trail or might be floating in the air? It's an arid landscape. You have a wildly diverse array of nature photography opportunities. Wildlife could be close, it could be far, they could be doing different things. You could be seeing huge animals, some of the biggest on earth, elephants and giraffe. you could then the next minute see tiger cubs that are, just, a few months old that are yay big. So you have to be prepared for a lot of different stuff out there. Your travel for many, many trips out there often involves some sort of airplane. Of course, we all have to take big airplanes over to the safari destination. But what about the small internal flights that we're often having to deal with? We usually have very limited restrictions on weight and size of our suitcases. And when we have fragile, precious camera gear, you got to scratch your head and think, how do I protect it? How do I deal with that on my safari? And last but not least, you're often pointing right in the hippo's mouth. Last but not least, you're often dealing with low light conditions. If you've been on a safari or if you're familiar with the daily itinerary of a safari, you're usually waking up pretty early in the morning. You're doing a big game drive from like kind of waking hours to mid-morning, maybe late morning. And that middle part of the day when the sun is brightest and the light is the brightest, we're usually actually hunkered down back at camp, either taking a little siesta or relaxing on the veranda, looking for wildlife at watering holes, but we're not out on game drives. And then we'll usually get back in the vehicle right around, late afternoon as the weather's starting to cool a little bit. Wildlife picks up in behavior and numbers again considerably. So we're often having to photograph in less than ideal lighting conditions. So how do we deal with that? We will answer all those things here in just a bit. But one of the most common questions I get from working at NatHab in the office, so in addition to an expedition leader, I work in the office too, and I answer a lot of photography questions. I also am our director of sustainability, but that's a topic for another webinar. But gear, like what do I bring? What's your favorite gear? What's in your kit? So the questions we're going to ask here, point and shoot versus DSLR. What kind of camera? What's the right kind of camera? What are the best lens combinations? Do I need to bring extra memory cards and memory backup? How do you back up memory while on safari? Batteries and charging. Will I have power at the camps? Stabilization. Should I bring a tripod, a monopod, a beanbag? How to protect against dust, I already mentioned. And should I bring a second camera body? Now, I know that we're gonna have a lot of different people in the audience today. So some people are like me, maybe like total techie nuts and want to talk about gear for hours. I could certainly do so. We're gonna keep this pretty to the point because I also know that a lot of people might not have so much gear to choose from. So this is not gonna be directly applicable, but I hope to answer everything for everybody and kind of give you a little bit of everything. So camera body is the very first thing. So we usually divide camera bodies into whether you have a point and shoot camera or what I call like a big fancy DSLR. I put modern day mirrorless cameras in that DSLR outfit, basically any camera that you need to change lenses for. So we'll start with the point and shoots. If you are like many out there, you will have a point and shoot camera that hopefully has some sort of zoom capability, some sort of telephoto capabilities. And both of these are point and shoots. One is more expensive and more advanced, but one is, they're both great. All three cameras are fantastic, but they offer different things for different people. So a lot of people don't want to fuss with bringing extra lenses and having to change lenses. That's when you open your camera up to dust. If you take that lens off, that makes your camera vulnerable. So I do recommend point and shoots for a lot of folks out there. And to get into specifics, the ones that I personally like, I love Canon's point and shoots. I think they're fantastic. This is what's known as HS70 IS. And it's great. It's got like 50 times optical zoom. It's a small package. It fits, about yay big. So a small camera case, and it runs about $500. Very, very good quality for what you pay for. The step up, which a lot of my colleagues are getting into these days, is it's a very small niche, but it's called bridge cameras. And Sony is dominating the market there. And I have seen excellent things with these Sony bridge cameras known as the RX10. What they offer is essentially an SLR or a mirrorless, so a very, very advanced camera body. But what they do is they have high-tech lenses, a very, very good sensor, and you don't have to change lenses. It's a little bit bigger, so now we're getting into like proper camera size. But again, it's a one-stop shop, one package for all. You can set it on auto if you wish, or you can watch my Nature Photography 102 and get off of auto and start experimenting with aperture modes and program modes and all that. But nevertheless, it's a great camera if you want something high quality to take on African safari and don't have to worry about those luggage limits, et cetera, et cetera. And they run about $1,200. We're getting up there in price, but it's one thing that you have, you buy it once and you never have to buy another lens or anything ever again. And then, of course, if you're the ultra discerning photographers, myself included, I often say I don't know whether it's the perfectionist that becomes a photographer or if photography makes you perfectionist. But I started with much lesser cameras than any of these on the screen. And I've wanted better and better and better. I want more megapixels. I want more definition. And now I do shoot with the DSLR, and the new mirrorless cameras that you'll see out today are just as good. And that's kind of like the pinnacle, but they cost more money. You have to bring more gear with you. But nevertheless, Nikon, Canon, Sony, Olympus, Fuji, they're all fantastic cameras. And we'll talk next, if you are in that category of the SLR and you do want to have extra lenses, change lenses, let me just quickly go through some of my go-tos. Okay, so if you have an SLR, a DSLR, or a mirrorless, something that you change lenses, this is the bare minimum that you need as far as lenses. You got to have some sort of telephoto zoom. My go-to, again, I'm a Canon guy, is a 100 to 400 millimeter. That's a great range. And then I also have a 24 to 105 millimeter. Now I'm shooting on full frame, so if you're using like an 18 to 55 or something like that, that's great. Stick with that. But essentially, you're trying to get something that gets you really wide, so like somewhere between 10 millimeters to 24 millimeters on the widest end of the spectrum, the smallest number, all the way up to like 400 millimeters on the most telephoto capabilities. Sometimes, depending on, how much gear you want to bring, your budget, your experience, 300 millimeters might be enough. But I will tell you, you will always want more zoom. You will always want more telephoto. That's, if there's any MO, if there's any adage, if there's any commonality of any sort of photo safari, it's that you can have the biggest bazooka lens out there, and there's always gonna be a couple shots that you see and say, ooh, if I had more zoom, I could have gotten that. So 400, I think, is a good, just what's out there. It keeps it conservative in terms of size, weight, and reasonable in terms of price as well. But some camera manufacturers are getting some really, really great, like 200 to 500 millimeters, like Nikon, Tamron, Sigma. So yeah, if you can get to 500 millimeters or 600 millimeters in one lens, those are pretty darn great. Okay, so if I have room, okay, now a smartphone, I actually always bring that anyway because I'm a guide, so I need to have communication possibilities out there. But if I have room, which I usually do, because I'm the guy that's going to bring 40 pounds of camera gear and 4 pounds of clothes, if I have a 44-pound limit. But these are the lenses that I usually try to bring with me. The 16 to 35, this is an ultra wide. It's almost like a fisheye, but not quite. It doesn't have like that distortion, but it's really, really, really wide. And I love that lens. If you are in a little bit more of an intro SLR, you might notice that Canon and Nikon both have a lens in like the 10 to 22 millimeter range. They're super wide. It's great for general travel photography, great for landscape photography. If I'm in a vehicle and I want to showcase how amazing, the wildebeest migration is around my entire group, this wide angle, this ultra wide angle is what I'm going to go to. And the 50 millimeter f1.4, this is a very, very shallow depth of field. So most of us have smartphones these days, and a lot of them are coming out with this idea of portrait mode. This is the lens for portrait mode, basically. The smartphone actually has technology in it that replicates what this lens does, but a 50 millimeter 1.4 gives you that really interesting professional look where you have one thing in focus and everything else is just wildly blurred outside of it. I think it's great for cultural photography. And honestly, I put it on when I'm back at camp and I'm just kind of sitting around, walking around, waiting for the next game drive. I'm just, looking at flowers, looking at maybe African drums in the corner of the camp. I'll go take some cool photographs because every shot that comes out with a 50 millimeter f1.4 is really cool. And then, again, a smartphone is a great second camera. While you have your big beefy telephoto on your main camera, you can use your smartphone for landscape shots, for travel shots. They're getting better and better. So I try to bring a smartphone, even if I'm not using it for communication. I use it for photography because it's very, very easy and the quality is very, very high. So questions, this actually is now going to go for anybody out there with any camera. Let's start off with memory. So definitely bring plenty of memory. I can't stress that enough. What I have here of 432 gigabytes, this is just a random example. Your camera, you should probably do some research to figure out, what size megapixel shots you're getting, how many shots do you get per 32 gigabyte card. You might want to bring 64 gigabyte cards. They're now up to like 256 gigabytes. You want to have enough for, honestly, maybe 500 photos per day. That's kind of like a good ballpark. Some people that are trigger happy and they're shooting on burst mode, you might honestly shoot 1,000 or 1,500 photos a day. Spend the extra little bit of money to get more memory cards. Memory is cheap in the grand scheme of things. Have backups. Sometimes cards fail. They don't work when you put them in the camera. Lots of memory. Batteries and chargers. So you definitely want to bring extra batteries. The big question here is, what is your recharge capability when you're back at camp? And I will say, usually we must think at the lowest common denominator. So usually what we should think about is how many camps and how many areas do not have central power or central power in my room that I can charge it at night. Usually it's not the whole time on African safari, but usually 1 or 2 camps throughout the course of your trip might have one battery charging station in the central common area. And everybody shares it, and it's done very, very well. Nobody's left without, but you might have to, have a couple extra batteries with you so you can charge a battery during the day, and then have a couple extra batteries that are fully charged on your person, and then swap them out at night or swap them out midday. So I usually bring 3 or 4 extra batteries with me just as precaution. Laptop and backup memory. So, if you do not have enough memory cards, or you're the kind of person that wants 2 or 3 backup copies, if you really, really are planning on doing some of these photos and you would be absolutely heartbroken if something happened to a memory card, you want to think about backing it up. I do actually bring my laptop with me on each and every trip. Part of it's because I am a guide. I have to do logistical work, and I'm pulling up forms and park entrance papers and checking things here and there. But it's a great way to back up. And what I'll often do is I'll back up a copy on my computer, and then I'll keep everything on a memory card. And then if I really need extra storage, if I'm on a very, very long trip, you'll notice here I have a little digital hard drive with me that's like a terabyte or 2, and I'll throw stuff on there. So we're kind of nearing the end of this gear section. We'll get into those actual photo tips for the rest of the presentation. But again, these are really important things to think about. Full tripod, is it necessary? I personally say no, especially when you have strong weight considerations for your charter flights and your luggage. There are a few shots I'm going to show you in the rest of this presentation that are night photos that I did use a tripod with. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll bring what's known as a gorilla pod. It's a fraction of the weight, fraction of the space, and it's at very least a stable surface that I can put my camera. It's not going to give me anywhere near the versatility of a full-size tripod. But for photographing at night, maybe I want to photograph a fire that we're having outside camp in the dark, or maybe try to photograph the stars at night, or photograph the beautiful dining setup we have, under the moonlight with candles. Something stable so I don't have to always rely on a rock is kind of nice. But if I don't have room for that, sometimes it's a choice. Do I bring the ultra wide angle lens? Do I bring an extra tripod? I might find a rock or a fence post in those cases. Monopod is something a lot of people do enjoy. I don't personally bring one, but if you are a very serious amateur photographer or a semi-pro or pro, and you have a big lens that you can't physically handhold the whole day, a monopod is a nice way to brace that camera, take off a bit of weight, brace it on the seat, brace it on the floor in front of you, and it's minimal. It's small. It fits in your luggage very easily. It can double as a walking stick sometimes. Not a bad idea. I don't personally, I would not put it on my list of required things, but that versus a tripod, if you have a big lens, monopod all the way. Camera beanbag, this is a really helpful thing for stabilizing your camera when you're in safari vehicles. Now, this is not going to help if the safari vehicle's rumbling along on the dirt road. I mean, the beanbag is going to do nothing. But what it does help for is when you are parked and maybe the engine hasn't quite been shut off because we're jockeying for position, or we're trying to just get right around for the perfect lighting of this lion. A beanbag is nice because it's just a semi-stable platform to put the tip of your lens. I will be honest, I don't often bring one, because we, Natural Habitat, we actually provide these in all of our photo safaris. But if you're not going with Natural Habitat, or you're doing a trip in the US national parks on your own or something like that, not going all the way over to Africa, bringing one on your own is great, but you can also get the same result by just bringing a sweatshirt. Putting a sweatshirt underneath your camera. I always like to multi-purpose gear when I have weight restrictions, or just generally because I try to be minimalist. I'm already bringing so much stuff with me and keeping track of so much. A beanbag, yeah, I can kind of see it, but I'm always going to think, well, is that seat pad in front of me cushioned? Fine, that's okay. And let's see, I think so that's pretty much it for that slide. And then so then the last couple things, are you going to bring a separate second camera body? If you're the kind of person that is asking if you should bring a second camera body because you have a second camera body, the answer is yeah, go ahead and bring it. It's really nice to have 2 different lenses on 2 different cameras so you don't have to switch. If you are just starting with photography and you say, well, gosh, do I really need to go spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars for a second camera body? If you're asking that question, then the answer is no. You don't need it. You don't have to have it. But if you have a second camera body, that might be more helpful than, you know, a fourth or fifth type of lens to bring with you. Sometimes people ask about these weather jackets. There are a lot of companies that make them out there. They're okay. It's just one more thing to get in the way. It kind of protects against dust. It can protect against rain and weather. Usually you're not going to get rain on African safari. This is, you know, I bring a very small one of these with me. It just never leaves my camera bag, but mainly because I'm bringing the same camera bag and the same stuff with me on almost every trip I do, whether I'm going to Africa, whether I'm going to Borneo. So specifically for Africa, not highly needed. And then also when it comes to second camera body, let's also, you know, be realistic. You know, your second camera body can be that old point and shoot that you haven't used for many years that, you know, is just an easy way to quickly take a shot of the group or quickly take a shot of the landscape that you don't need something more powerful for. Okay, so that was a whirlwind going through a lot of gear. Again, I know I probably maybe lost some of you there because you don't need to worry about all that because you have a nice compact point and shoot that's going to do great for you. But again, it's one of the big considerations is what kind of gear to bring on African safari. So I'm just going to take a quick sip of coffee here. So top photo techniques. Okay, so this is like what I really enjoy talking about. This is the meat and potatoes of the talk here. You're going to Africa. What are the things you want to think about as far as top photo techniques? Maybe things you want to start practicing or things you want to start reading up a little bit more on. Let's get into it. So wildlife portraiture. Even though we're not sitting in the back of an Olin Mills or, you know, a Walmart photo studio, portraiture is still the idea that you're taking photographs of something that kind of fills the frame. See how this line is mostly filling the edge of the frame here? It is a portrait. There are a few considerations to make with wildlife portraiture here, okay? So the first is always focus on the eyes. You'll hear me, I think I said that 45 times in my Photo 101 talk a couple weeks ago, but we're gonna kind of cut to the brass tacks of wildlife portraiture here. Always focus on the eyes. You can focus on a lot of other stuff. I mean, if you have the nose in focus, that's great. If this paw's in focus, that's great. But you've got to focus somewhere. If you don't have the eyes in focus, you're going to lose a lot of viewers. It's not going to look good. It's going to look like you didn't nail the shot. So if there's anything to focus on the eyes, and then just be happy when everything else is in focus. You also want a shallow depth of field, okay? And we're gonna, I'm gonna give you a resource here, or if you email us or call us after this presentation, we're gonna give you a resource here of a photo cheat sheet where I talk a little bit more about how to set a shallow depth of field. Basically what I'm talking about here is notice how the background is slightly blurred, and even the foreground here is slightly blurred. What that does is it helps draw focus in on the lion's face. The lion's face is in great focus, so even the shallowest depth of field, that smallest aperture number is going to be fine for keeping what you want in focus, but it's going to help minimize the distractions close and in the back, and that helps a lot with wildlife portraiture. And also, lastly, use the rule of thirds. You know, all rules are always meant to be broken, but you should start off using the rule and then be able to justify to yourself as to why you're not using it. So the rule here, let's go back here. The rule here is that you want, oh, I guess I missed the transition there. Well, you kind of get the point. This is gonna be another replica of the exact other slide, but we'll whip through it one more time here. See, when you do too many build-ins in these PowerPoints, they just, you know, technology. But you can see, I'm going to give you a very quick moment to see it. When that tic-tac-toe board is over the line, notice how it's not in the dead middle of the frame. And notice how one of those cross intersecting points is right in the lion's face. It's a great example of when you want to off-center your photo. See that for a split second? Boom, right there. So same thing with this little baby cheetah. We're going to talk about focus on the eyes, shallow depth of field. Notice how the background is very, you know, a lot more brush. If this were all in perfect focus as the foreground were, it would just be even more cluttered in the frame. This is a very, very busy frame. This is in the green season in Botswana, so there's lush, beautiful verdant grass. I actually love the green season in Botswana for photography for this very reason, but you have to pay really particular attention to nailing the focus on what you want to focus on, and then having that shallow depth so everything before and after it tends to be out of focus. Now in this case, that cheetah is right in line with the foreground vegetation. So what I'm actually doing is, I know there's no way I can get it out of focus. I'm actually using it as a frame. So the framing of this is drawing your attention into the cheetah and getting you to look at what I'm trying to get you to look at, basically. And then use a rule of thirds. So let's see if it works this time. So notice how right there, oh, see, it's staying here. Okay, great. So notice how, you know, what I'm doing with the rule of thirds here is I've got the bottom third with all this green grass, The middle third, I've got the cheetah, and the upper third is just some of that top framing vegetation, just kind of crunching the photo, drawing your attention into one small part of the photo, but also that small part of the photo happens to be very, very close to an intersecting point. So the general rule is provide some sort of significance to the intersecting point, an intersecting point, and then break the scene down into thirds in some way. A lot is left to interpretation. I can't stress that enough. There's no perfect way to use the rule of thirds, but add significance in thirds rather than halves or quarters or fifths or whatever. And also, when you can, put your subject at one of those intersecting points, and you're going to see your photos look a lot better. I can promise you. Another one of the big rules of composition is leading lines, okay? This is a great technique and a great example here. Now, we don't see as many leading lines in pure, pristine nature. There just aren't a lot of man-made structures, but there sometimes are trees, there sometimes are even safari tracks. We're gonna come back to this later in the talk of how, even man-made things you might view as kind of unsightly, like, hey, I don't want to get a lion, on a road. But what we can actually do is use this to your advantage and use this as a leading line, and notice how it goes right and directs the eyes away from the lion where the lion's gazing to this cool little stand of trees in the back. Like, oh, that must be its little place of refuge. You're incorporating this extra element into the scene. And I think that this wavy curvature of the road really helps that. It kind of creates a sense of wonder. So using leading lines, again, no perfect way to use it, just adding significance somehow to create your own artistry in the scene before you. All right, capturing big landscapes. So Africa, very big landscapes. Some tips here. So opposite of wildlife portraiture, a wide depth of field. So that means a big aperture number. So you want to have a wide depth of field to get as much in focus as possible. I always advocate that you want to pick out specific subjects in your shots even for landscapes. Yes, this sunset would be beautiful without these trees, but it's even cooler to have something that your eyes are kind of focusing on, providing context. We all know what a tree is, approximate size of a tree. We don't know exactly how big these acacias are, but what it does is it gives you this impression of, wow, that's a big sun. So it gives you context and this extra level to your photos if you pick out some sort of subject in the landscape as well. And you'll see in a few slides how wildlife can be that subject as well. And I oftentimes like to exaggerate composition. So even though I do want to start with the rule of thirds, one way that I often break that rule is I exaggerate it. So normally what you would do with the rule of thirds is put this sun in the top third and, maybe put this horizon line down here right at that bottom third line, but I actually have it even lower. I have it just barely a little sliver of that line of that horizon, that earth at the bottom. And what I'm doing is I'm exaggerating this open space. I'm exaggerating the sky. And again, there's no right way to do that, but sometimes you can exaggerate landscapes by showing the land is very little, but the sky is huge. We can see that here in the deserts of Namibia as well. This is one of the most iconic landscape trips in Africa. Deserts of Namibia and Sossusvlei here is this landscape. So what I'll do here is I'm suggesting that you adjust your perspective. That's a great way to show big landscapes. So here we have these dead trees and the dead vlei, as it's called, and I'm kind of getting down. I'm using one of those ultra wide angle lenses that I talk about. I say that that's only something that I bring if I can really afford to bring it. On a big landscape trip like Namibia is, that's kind of a must. So I adjust my perspective, show that depth. I have to say it's rather hard to showcase these many 100-foot sand dunes in the big grandiose way. So you're going to see in the next few photos ways you can actually incorporate other elements to showcase a big landscape in a big way. So then also focus on the foreground. That's one of the key things that I'll say is that if you focus, you want the background in focus and the tree in focus, and that's why I suggest a wide depth of field. But if you prioritize and focus on the dunes and you get this tree blurred, the shot's gonna be blown. If this looked blurred, no matter how in focus this is, the shot's not gonna turn out. So I always wanna focus on this, even if I zoom in and make the picture really big, it might be a little bit blurred, but always focus on the foreground. The other thing I'll do is I'll think about my cropping as I'm taking the photo. So you notice this is not a normal crop. See this photo, how it's very elongated? It's almost like a panoramic photo from back in the day of film when you would put panoramic film or even buy a panoramic camera. But what I do is when I have big landscapes, sometimes I anticipate that I'm gonna crop it in the computer weeks from the time that I take it, and I compose the shot for that very reason. Here we're kind of looking at the rule of thirds. The middle ground is going to be that nice orange sand dune in the tree. The bottom third more or less is this salty vley, and then the sky is the upper third. So I wanted to stretch that out, knowing that I could really showcase all three elements there. And then I think one of the biggest things for landscape photography and photography in general is don't always try to get it all. Don't try to get every single part of that big landscape all in the photo. Or if you do, take the photo, document it, great. You got it, you tried, you got it all. But oftentimes what I'll do is I'll break the scene into individual pieces. Like notice this, there is a 500-foot sand dune behind these trees, but you wouldn't really know it. It's really just this nice pleasing color. But what you're likely to do, and this is a more common tendency today, especially with social media and the way digital photography is portrayed and showcased, is that people aren't usually just seeing one photo. You're usually sharing like an album, or you're sharing 4 or 5 photos at a time. So I think breaking it into components and getting maybe that lower angle photo that I started off with, maybe that panoramic photo to show the left and right sweep, and then a zoomed in photo like this to show, wow, like when you're really comparing these trees to these sand dunes, we're talking about a big landscape. And then once again, exaggerating composition. A great way to show scale in big landscapes with big features is, again, normal rule of thirds would have you probably put this salt vley on the bottom third, maybe even coming up right here in the frame, and then the trees middle part, and then the sand dune in the upper part. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to exaggerate it by just showing a little sliver of the ground, and that way it shows how expansive, just like that other sunset photo I showed you, how expansive the sky was. This is showing you how expansive the sand dune is. Think unconventionally, okay? So think beyond the classic photo when you're on an African safari. Even if this presentation is the only thing you've ever seen about Africa, you're gonna get some classic photos here. But I always implore you to think beyond the classic. So what I'm talking about here is, don't try to always get the Nat Geo shot or the cover of the guidebook. A lot of those shots I actually call, guidebook photos. They're cool, they're beautiful, but actually in the grand scheme of things, they're kind of boring, to be honest. I mean, yes, maybe if you're a pro photographer, that helps, put food on the table, but sometimes that classic shot of, the perfectly positioned lion silhouetted just as like a portraiture can be boring. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually thinking beyond this. Now, truth be told, I didn't have the ability to get a clear shot, but I use this to my advantage. I said, wow, this little young leopard is sitting in these dense bushes. I can't believe our tracker found this leopard. This is amazing. I'm gonna showcase how hidden, how secretive, how elusive this cat is, and I'm gonna frame it. I'm only gonna, again, focus on the eyes, but I'm only gonna get a little bit of the cat in that frame. And again, maybe as a one-off photo, it doesn't provide a lot to the photo album or a lot to my, to demonstrate my photography. But within a photo album, and what a great story this is by thinking beyond the classic shot and being a little bit more artistic. Another example, so here is actually kind of your classic shot. Now it's cool, I'm very proud of this shot, I like it. Maybe it's not boring to you, or maybe it is boring to some of you, but what I'm talking about is thinking beyond this and waiting for that moment that you can do something different. So here's a shot, I actually personally like this photo more. Now, yes, it's black and white, and we'll kind of come to that in a second, but look what I've done here. How have I thought beyond the classic? How am I thinking unconventionally? Well, one, I'm not focusing on the animal at all. I'm not focusing on the eyes. I'm breaking one of my golden rules. The other thing is, it's this interesting black and white representation. It's this lion that appears to be kind of stalking its prey, and I'm deliberately getting out of focus to help tell that story of where I found that animal, what it was doing, telling the behavior. I think it's really cool. So I actually focused on this little grass, these reeds in the foreground, just thinking differently. So again, 9 times out of 10, I want to focus on the animal, not the grass. But if you think in a storytelling manner and think beyond, you might get some really cool shots to show of it. And then again, black and white is always something that you can play around with in the computer afterwards. I think it works for some shots. Most of the time, if you're not a true dedicated black and white photographer, I think sometimes it's a little bit hard to nail. But in some shots, these kind of eerie classic shots, well, I guess thinking beyond the classic, but kind of like an eerie unclassic shot, this one really works quite well. Okay, so moving on, turn wildlife into landscape photography. So what I'm talking about here is sometimes when you're close to wildlife, it's our first intuition to zoom as far as you can into this animal, fill the frame with the head of this Cape buffalo or of this lion, because we want to see the animal and its face and its expressions. And that's great. I don't think you should not get that shot. But I think that sometimes we're so consumed by that if the animal comes closer and closer and closer, what we do on African safaris, and this is actually the case with any wildlife safari, any wildlife photography, is we get stuck just photographing the animal with the most zoom we have to just blow it up in the frame. Because remember, we're looking in the back of our cameras a lot. We're looking at it very, very small, and we want to see that animal's head as big as possible. But sometimes, step back and think of it more as a landscape shot. What are the elements I'm going to have to make this a great landscape shot and incorporate the wildlife in it? So another example here. Again, I could have zoomed all the way in and gotten this beautiful oryx, and maybe turn the frame into something like this. I'm just boxing it with my arrow here. But no, I zoomed out. I had a wide angle shot on, and I wanted to take this beautiful landscape shot, which also would have been great without this oryx, or hemsbok as they're called locally in Namibia. But what you do is when you get a cool wildlife shot with a cool scenic shot, the sum is actually greater than the parts. Okay, so if you get like a pretty cool shot of both and incorporate them, you actually get a really, really extraordinary shot. So I always advocate trying to zoom out a little bit. Don't completely disregard, get the shot of that hemsbok close up if you can, but usually we have time to get both, and don't stop there. Get the landscape shot with the wildlife and show how big the scenery can be. And on this vein, you can also turn travel shots into landscape shots. A great technique here. We're going to talk a little bit more about travel photography here in a few seconds, so I won't stay on the slide too much, but a few examples of things that I've talked about and shown earlier. I'm adjusting my perspective. I'm getting low and shooting up, shooting that whole sky. I've got kind of a minimal rule of thirds here going on, and I'm using a cool transportation mechanism to show my travel adventure. All right, moving on. Another tip here, capturing lots of animals in one scene. So this is rather specific to the Great Migration, which I think, if many of you are headed to Africa in the coming year, I'll bet you a lot of you are going to go see the Great Migration, which is absolutely fantastic. It can be kind of tough. Like, how do you showcase this whole thing? We all want to showcase every single animal, but it can be quite hard. I will tell you, like this shot that I have, this is me trying to showcase every animal in the scene, but it's not. It's a descriptor kind of shot, but it's not the very, very best shot that I think that I got from this day, from this year of travel into the Masai Mara. So a few rules here that I'll share. One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to think about layering. Again, I'm going to almost the same thing as that landscape tip that I gave you, is don't try to capture everything all at once. Break it into small pieces and get this, this, and this. Think with different sizes of the crop. Think with layering in this case. So what I'm doing is I'm picking out one animal that I'm going to showcase. This is my main subject, and I want to show the depth. I want to show the depth of these animals, how far they go back. Some of this is very, very determined by where I am, where my safari vehicle is. You can't just turn any shot into this layering effect. But when you start to see it, start thinking, oh, you're going to be an African safari in a few months. You're going to say, oh gosh, Court said this thing about layering when you have this depth in the scene to showcase a number of animals. This is a great shot to have a go at it. And so here's another example. We're following this wildebeest herd. I've got some in the foreground. I can focus on these guys with that shallow depth of field. The background completely melts away, but you can still tell they're more wildebeest. So what that shows the viewer, whether it's you or someone else later on down the road, is that, yeah, there were a lot of animals here. And I think this is a great way to showcase the herds of massive, massive animals. And then, the final way, or one of the final ways, is to provide context. I know a lot of people really hate when they see a vehicle in their frame. When we're photographing out to something cool, then a vehicle comes in, and we say, oh, goodness gracious, this botched the shot, this ruined the shot. I use this to my advantage because oftentimes this helps provide more of a picture yourself here kind of moment. So I never shy away. I think it's a great way to also show scale and numbers on a safari. So it's incorporating vehicles into your shot. But lastly, basically my main MO when I see a lot of animals, and again, here we have impala, totally different than the wildebeest and zebra, but if you're going to Africa, you're very likely to see many of these. The best way to showcase this herd of about 30 or 40 was to pick out this small section of about 10 or 15 where they're just layered and stacked and clustered together, and then really try to pick out one that I focus on. In this case, I'm waiting for that perfect moment where it just happens to turn its head to me, and I'm kind of getting everything. Again, greater than the sum of its parts. I got a great animal looking at me, in focus, on the eyes, layering, showcasing, rule of thirds, bada bing, bada boom. All right, moving on to a different subject, photographing in low light. My best advice here, so again, I mentioned that if you're gonna go on an African safari, chances are you're gonna have a few shots every day that are in lower light conditions than you feel are ideal. I embrace it. And so the main thing that I do is I look at the shot and I try to make it kind of dark and moody. Oftentimes, certain cameras will struggle with shooting fast enough. You might have to brace your camera on the vehicle, brace it on your knee. One trick that I'll often do, if you can see me and my webcam right now, is I'll use my elbows and I'll brace it on my thighs like this, or I'll brace my two elbows on the edge of the safari vehicle. So I have those 2 points of contact, and then I'll take the shot and I'll kind of do, like target practice, like breathe in, exhale halfway, and then take the shot. Okay. So there are certain tricks to, beyond that I can share, and I might do so in a follow-up webinar, but with low light, I take most of that out of the equation, and I'm really trying to prioritize for that dark and gloomy look, and I actually will slow my camera down a little bit, and we'll show you how to do that in a second. But again, I'm visualizing these scenes of how can I make it a little bit darker. Oftentimes cameras, what they do is even if you're in low light, they're still trying to expose at dead even. And if you recall from my photography 102 presentation last week, that means it's about like 18% pure gray in the scene. What I advocate for, again, looking at these scenes with these big pillowy clouds, these dark storms approaching, dusk approaching, is I will actually I'll force my camera to darken the shot. And how do you do so? Well, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look for this little icon on my camera. It's usually somewhere in the menu. You might want to take this time that we have some downtime at home and look in your camera's manual of how do you find exposure compensation. And usually on your camera, it will ultimately manifest to look like this, kind of like a little -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. And what you can do is you can actually dial this to this left side, this negative side, and you can force your camera to take a photo in darker conditions. And what that does, that gives that very dark, moody look to the photo. It's a really, really fun thing to play with. I highly recommend you try it out. Here, this is our little Nat Hab photography cheat sheet. This is what I was talking about at the start of the presentation. If you shoot us an email, I'll show the email address on the last slide of this presentation. If you shoot us an email and ask for this, we'll email you out a PDF digital copy of this. And this talks about exposure right here in this scene. And it talks about how you can, kind of make lemonade when you have those too dark of scenes to capture properly. Again, dark and moody. Now, I promised I would showcase a couple of photos where I am thinking about maybe using a tripod. So again, very judicious on whether I take the space and wait to bring a full-size tripod on a trip, but oftentimes having something like a little travel tripod, a gorilla pod, or even just finding another table that I can set my camera on to take scenes like this is really, really fun. If you're headed on African safari, you're gonna see scenes like this. This is something, African camps love to pamper people and make people feel special. Romantic candlelight dinners, if it's just a couple of you, or even candlelight group dinners like you see here. It's really, really fun to be under the big African sky and live this, have the memory. I mean, that's probably the greatest thing, is actually being here and living it, but what a beautiful thing to capture. So kind of a great segue from that low light into this next topic. Don't forget about travel photography and storytelling. A lot of people I've seen on my photo trips that I'm guiding, around the dinner table in a beautiful scene like this, they'll bring their cameras, but most of the time they'll be looking at the great wildlife shots they got that day. And trust me, they're going to be great, and they'll be sharing. We might be talking about them. We might say, oh, I love what you did with this, with the antelope in the left and then the lion in the right hand corner. But really what we should be doing is paying attention to how extraordinary the scenery is each day, each and every moment. We find ourselves to be a little bit, we get comfortable very quickly when we're in places like this. And next time you're on a trip, next time even you're out to eat at a really cool restaurant, notice how once you've been there for a few minutes or even a few hours, you might just get really accustomed to the scenery and forget how special the occurrence is. So don't ever hesitate to take photos. People sometimes laugh about people taking photos of their own food or their plates or their rooms. That's cool. That's storytelling. That is travel photography. So I definitely recommend it. Again, scenes like this is what you will see. This is from Namibia. The photo before here, we're in the Kalahari Delta, or sorry, Kalahari Desert of Botswana. Okavango Delta is somewhere else in Botswana. The Kalahari Desert. You're going to see this if you go there, and it's a good excuse to get that camera out at dinner time, bring a small tripod, or just find a table nearby to get a great shot from. Also, we are often in small charter planes when we're cruising around Africa, and this is a great time to take photographs out the window. What I will often see people doing is trying to avoid the aircraft actually when they're taking photos out the window. They'll try to angle themselves so it's only the scene below, and that's great. But I actually think, in my personal opinion, and at the end of the day, you have to be the happiest with your photos. In my personal opinion, what makes me happy to see is this airplane wing in this photo. I love this. It makes me remember that time I was looking out the window down on these massive orange sand dunes, and then one of those vlays that we were photographing from with the trees and the low angle and all that. So I think I love the context that it shows. And that now that I'm looking at it and moving this cursor, doesn't this give you kind of like some nice leading lines? Doesn't this edge right here kind of direct your eye down to the dunes? This is what I'm trying to get you to look at as the viewer of my photograph. And these harsh, firm leading lines actually direct your eyes down here. Kind of a cool aside. But nevertheless, don't hesitate to get things that you would normally not feature in your photos, because when you're in a different country, in a different place, it all adds to the story. People are the same way too. Like I mentioned before with vehicles, we'll get to that in a second again, but getting people in your photographs, even on safari, is a great thing. Yes, we all want the guidebook cover photo of the animal filling the frame, with the rhino's face right there and the horn, just massive photo. But providing context and giving that picture yourself here moment, I think, is hugely important for travel photography. So don't forget about the travel aspect of travel photography. Vehicles on safari, again, people might look at this and say, oh gosh, this would have been so perfect if that vehicle weren't there, because these four lions are walking out, the big male in the background there. I actually loved it. I said, guys, this is the best blessing we could have had. We've got a vehicle, it's kind of mostly empty. It's not a bunch of people standing on their seats. It's a quiet, tranquil, sedentary vehicle. It's not moving, so it's not going to get any sort of motion blur. And we get an amazing picture yourself here moment with this photo. So I will look at those things and change my photography. I will wrap the vehicle into my photograph, or the person in my photograph, to provide that context. We showed this before, and just to underline, having that story behind your photo is huge. This leopard was super hard to find. It was super hard to spot. So let's use this brush around it, kind of frame the animal, draw your attention in the middle, but also let's tell the story visually of how hard these animals are to see from time to time. And I mentioned black and white photography before. I love black and white photography, especially for cultural photography. So depending on where you're going in Africa, you may have a great opportunity to visit local villages and meet local folks there and hear stories and dance with them and do all sorts of crazy fun stuff. Not all of your photos have to be black and white, but I do find a lot of times when local folks are putting on cultural demonstrations, these two young guys in Botswana, these San Bushmen, were showing me how they would build fire. And I think it provides this wonderful historic classic feel to a really cool scene. They are proudly wearing their traditional garb, little antelope horns on the guy's head, and I think it really adds to the photo, and especially because you have this really bright fire here. You have this wonderful, beautiful contrast, and look how the light is just so soft in this guy's face. A good time to experiment with black and white photography. Most of the time, you don't do this in the shot. You don't do it in your camera when you're taking it. It's usually after the fact on your computer at home. But nevertheless, it's maybe 3 seconds if you're using Lightroom or Photoshop or Picasa or any of the photo editing programs, iPhoto. You can usually dial that saturation slider back and forth and just kind of see does it make you like the photo better? And that's what it's all about. All right, capturing fast-moving animals. This is a pretty important one on safari. This is probably what most people think of as capturing a fast-moving animal, and it definitely hits the nail on the head. This is an African wild dog, voracious predator, absolutely amazing creature. It was hunting an impala, or maybe a lechwe. I can't quite recall, but definitely one of the smaller antelope species. And I just got it captured perfectly in full stride. I'm probably photographing this guy at like 1/2000th of a second. But truthfully, all animals on an African safari are moving. You very rarely will get a good photo of sleeping animals on safari, because as soon as you're around, their heads perked up, they're looking around, but more often than not, they're just totally indifferent. They're going about their daily life, and you really want to capture it without any what we call motion blur. So capturing fast moving animals, or any moving animals, you got to think about your shutter speed. And there's a huge range of acceptable shutter speeds that you can use. Generally, for truly running animals, you got to be shooting at 1/1500th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. Now, this is where the photo cheat sheet is going to really come into handy, because you don't have to be writing these notes. You can, of course, watch this presentation over. I know the recording will be sent out to you afterwards, but on that cheat sheet, it dials in those numbers pretty specifically to where you want to be for fast-moving animals versus more sedentary things. So again, like 1/1000 or higher.
Uh-oh, Court just froze. Kendall, are you hearing Court?
Truthfully, this is a moving animal. Sometimes we can get a little bit lower, but the last thing you want is this cub to be perfectly not. From every trip of
Okay,
those guidebook photos of the.
Court,
Oh,
we're losing you.
oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
I seem to be able to hear you now. Yep.
Oh, okay,
So,
good.
yeah.
How long ago did you lose me?
Maybe 30 seconds?
Okay, gotcha. I can rewind a little bit. So we were just kind of talking about this, where you really need this animal to be crisp as well, and that means a fast shutter speed. Sometimes if you're shooting on a point and shoot camera, that's the little running man icon. If you do shoot on any sort of manual mode, whether that's aperture or preferably shutter speed, that cheat sheet that we're going to be able to send out to you is going to dial in and tell you what those speeds really need to be. And we're usually talking about 1/500 or 1/1000 of a second. But like I said, sometimes the most fun I have with photography on African safaris, when I'm trying to like complete my portfolio, is when I'm actually blurring the motion a little bit. And this is a really great example. So I'm actually shooting at a really slow shutter speed. You can program this in on shutter speed priority, or sometimes it has like a little S on the dial. Great time to look at your camera's manual if you wish to do so during this downtime and figure out how to program these slow shutter speeds. And what they do is they provide motion into the photo. And I love these because, yes, a great crisp photo is really fun. It's very charismatic. It's beautiful. It's that guidebook shot. But sometimes when we talk about storytelling, which I think is so integral into photography, this motion showing how wildly fast this baboon is running across the savannah is a really compelling photo. So dialing that shutter down, doing the opposite of what you normally think for fast-moving wildlife, can be really fun. All right, guys, so we're nearing the end of this presentation here. Some of the last shots I'm going to show, last tips, is about sunrises and sunsets in Africa. Very appropriate. So I'm going to give you kind of like the Court Whelan patented step 1 through 4 of how to get great sunrise shots. So telephoto or zoom, as we sometimes call it, is your friend. This is where you want to take a very small part of the scene before you, even though the whole sunset or sunrise is beautiful, paring it down closely is really key. So telephoto is your friend. Focus and meter on the color. That means, get those clouds in focus in the background, and that's going to meter your camera or tell your camera how much light it needs, and that's going to basically darken your shot to really express those clouds and those colors perfectly. If instead you focus on these trees, what it's going to do is it's going to try to lighten those trees to get you that perfect exposure, and it's going to blow out the sky. The sky's going to look really washed out, pale yellow, maybe not even get many of these reds and oranges. So contrary to what you might think, generally you want to focus on the clouds themselves, and that's going to give you an amazing color. Set your white balance to cloudy. Okay, so another thing that you might want to look at in your camera's manual, how to custom set your white balance. Setting it to cloudy injects natural colors, but it's on the blue to yellow spectrum. It's gonna be more in the yellow. So sunsets and sunrises are exceptional because of how much yellow and orange and red. You want to express those colors properly. So set your white balance to cloudy. And when fourth and last tip, if you can pick a subject, try to pick a subject in your scene. The sunset is great, but notice how on all the previous photos, I have something going on. Acacia trees in this photo and the previous one, I had those reeds in the foreground. What they do is they provide, again, that beautiful context to the photo that I think is so important with sunrises and sunsets and really all landscape shots. Yes, the sun would be great. going back, this would be great if those trees weren't there, but truly ask yourself, how much better does that make the shot to get that silhouette there? Oh, love it. All right, guys, you stuck with me. I appreciate it. I want to give you a resource here. This is a fantastic website that I'm editor of with Natural Habitat Adventures. It's our photo tutorial website. Hugely helpful, whether you're a beginning photographer, advanced, professional. Naturalphotographer.org. I publish articles weekly. Notice how, I have an article here, see some of my photos, what's in the bag for an African photo safari. And I have these for all of our trips around the world, how to get this shot, how to, my top 3 tips for photographing the lions. I definitely recommend bookmarking this. Check it out. A great resource wherever in the world you're headed, even just your own backyard for wildlife photography. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to me yap for the better part of an hour. Remember, if you'd like to email us here at info@nathab.com, or if you're already in touch with someone in our office, just shoot him or her an email and say, hey, I just listened to Court's webinar. I'd love that photo cheat sheet. Our team in the office is standing by. They're ready to send that out to you guys. And again, it's a great resource. You can either keep it on your iPad or on your phone. You can print a copy out and bring it with you, stick it in your camera bag. And it's a really, really good way to level up your photography. So next time you're anywhere, there's some great nature and wildlife, you're sure to get some great photos. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Court. That was terrific. And as you can imagine, we've got a lot of questions. So I think we'll continue on for a few minutes past the hour. If anyone in the audience needs to leave, we'll make sure that you get the link to the replay with this after the webinar Q&A. So let's jump right into this. We have a friend with us, Odin. He is 11. And Odin would like to know how far you need to be away from a wild animal to take a picture.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple ways to answer that. The most straightforward way is, technically, with the right gear, you can be at any distance really, but more, sort of like the ethical wildlife photography, there are different regulations that we certainly abide by. Even in a lot of cases, we help write those regulations just because of our expertise and experience in these countries. But, generally, as a wildlife biologist, I definitely am looking at, I want to be a minimum of 50 yards away or 100 feet away or 25 feet, whatever the regulation is for that species in that country. But more, I'm looking for behavior because certain animals can be more wary. And so even if I'm well outside of the regulation, if I'm pushing an animal, meaning like as I approach it, if it's moving farther away, I stop. I'm done. I don't want to push that animal at all because I'm encroaching in its natural behavior. And the last thing I want to do is have any negative effect on the wildlife I'm photographing. That all being said, there are certain countries in the world, especially like Botswana, where the wildlife is so well taken care of, you can actually approach quite safely and quite responsibly, pretty closely. We're talking about 20 feet or less. The idea is that when you're in a big safari vehicle, you are just another thing on the landscape. You are not 5 people in a truck. You are just some big thing, bigger than the lion, bigger than the giraffe, bigger than the whatever. And so the animals actually, through the course of many years of doing this, they're indifferent. They don't care that you're there. They just go about their natural behavior. And it makes for, great ethical wildlife photography and really, really great photos because they're just natural. And I can tell you in, 15, 20 years of doing this, 99 times out of 100, that's the reaction we get from wildlife is total indifference, which is awesome. I hope that answered your question. I may not have totally gotten it right, in terms of truly how far you have to be away with a wide angle lens. With my puppy that I have at home, I'm kind of right in its face, but sometimes, yeah, you might be 100 yards away, about a football field away. And that's why we recommend those telephoto lenses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, building on that, we had a question here from Kevin. Can you tell us about techniques used to photograph nocturnal mammals, for example, bush babies and genets?
Yeah, great question. They are hard to photograph. They are among some of the more rare safari animals to see, mainly because usually we have a pretty small window of when we're likely to see them. And if we're not in the right place at the right time, it's pretty challenging. The trick is basically, and it sounds like you probably know your way around a camera. So I'll talk pretty quickly on advanced techniques here. Put it on spot metering. Put your camera on spot metering so it only meters for the dead middle of your frame, and make sure that animal is in the middle of your frame. Crop the shot, recompose the shot later. But the thing is it's really hard to get proper exposure at night. But most likely what's happening is if you see one of these animals, they're like in maybe like in a spotlight of a lodge, or maybe, in a safari truck, we have a red light looking around, which is safe for the animals. That when it's shining on the animal is lit up, but everything else is around it is very, very dark. So you have to get the exposure really right. So spot metering is the most important thing. And then oftentimes I will dial my exposure down by -1, -2, just because I know that I can't get that much light. And then I'll usually lighten it in Photoshop afterwards.
Hmm. Well, speaking of metering, that was my next question. Where do you meter on landscape shots?
Yeah, great. So remember, there's kind of two parts. When you hold that shutter down halfway, you're focusing and you're metering. So you're focusing that, just because this is equally helpful. On a landscape shot, the general rule is you should focus about 1/3 of the way to the end of your landscape. So if I'm photographing a big mountain scene, mountains might be 5 miles away. I'm focusing somewhere about 1/3 of the way to those final mountains. That's the best way to get everything in focus. Metering, usually I'm less worried about that, because most of the time I am using evaluative metering, and the camera is usually smart enough to get a general correct lighting scheme. So I'm not really metering on the sky or the ground or the mountain. I'm letting my metering spot be the same as the focusing spot. That saves me a step. It's usually pretty close to right, especially on the evaluative setting. And then if I need to tweak lighting after the fact, it's usually spot lighting that I might have to lighten or darken the sky, and that's all done in Photoshop.
Hmm. Okay. A couple more questions for you. From this one from Mark. What's your view on teleconverters? If you can't afford the biggest lens, is the quality compromise too great?
Brilliant question. I probably should have covered that, because that's something that people are no doubt thinking about. Very, very subjective. In my mind, unless you're using what we call a super telephoto, like the really big ones, they're usually like the prime lenses. They're fixed focal lengths, like 300 millimeters. That's it. There's no zoom. It's not like a 100 to 400. You just have a 400 millimeter or a 500 millimeter. Usually those are pretty good to use teleconverters. Anything else, I don't think it's acceptable. I think usually you can get the same quality as putting a teleconverter on by simply cropping in on the computer, most often than not. The big super telephotos, which are, you're probably not talking about those because they cost an arm and a leg. They're usually like $10,000 plus. Those respond very well to teleconverters. Yeah, shocker, right? The expensive stuff. Those respond very well, but like your medium zooms, your normal zooms, like your 70 to 300s, 100 to 400s, no, I don't like them personally.
Hmm. Okay. All right. I'm going to combine a question from Carolyn and one from Greg. Carolyn would like you to please go over the dust protection that you mentioned one more time, and Greg is wondering for carrying your equipment in Africa, do you prefer hard or soft-sided?
Yeah, great. So dust protection, generally the best dust protection is just to keep the lens cap on and keep your camera in its bag when you're bumping around and it's dusty. That cover that I showed you is like a little rain jacket for the camera. If you're in really dusty conditions, that might be good to put on your camera. But usually the dust can be so fine. The best thing is just to put it in its bag entirely during those dusty conditions. That all being said, and I didn't really cover this thoroughly, but I do carry like a little toothbrush with me, like a very soft bristle toothbrush. That way, if I get dust on the outside of the camera, I might just brush it off with a toothbrush. The only real risk is dust getting in your sensor, which means, that's when you're changing lenses. So be extra careful. That's why two bodies can be very helpful. Or dust getting in like the gears and the working parts. So if you have dust in your camera, I just try to blow it off. I don't scrub it off too much. If dust does get in the little gears and the turning parts, that's when I get my toothbrush and just try to wipe it out. Because what'll happen, even on very weather protected cameras, if that dust gets in the moving parts and you're zooming and focusing, it can grind that dust even further, and it can actually get in through the lens, and that's when you have kind of like long-term problems. So the most important thing, again, I just keep my camera bag on the seat by me. When I'm not actively photographing, if we're doing a long commute and I know that we're not an imminent chance of seeing wildlife, that I have to whip my camera out real quickly, is just keep my camera away. And I've been in some places where it is really, really dry, and having that storm shield, that little rain jacket as backup is a good plan of action. Oh, and
Mm-hmm.
then the soft-sided versus hard-sided. I am always soft-sided. I know that that's kind of unnerving. It'd be great to have hard-sided. It's more protective. I've found that it's really not that necessary. And I've done so many of these trips. I have expensive camera gear of my own. I just make sure that I handle all my own camera gear. So my camera gear is always carry on. I'll carry it on even the small charter planes, and they let you do that. You can bring carry-ons. And I just have some extra padding. So I have every lens in a soft lens case, and I have that soft lens case in a soft bag. I'll just make sure not to drop it, throw it around. But that all being said, the more expensive gear is more durable, so you can get away with a little bit of knocking around here and there as long as it's padded. That's totally fine. And then that all being said, hard cases are usually prohibited actually on a lot of these small charter flights. You cannot bring a hard case, but even if we were allowed to, like a hard-sided Pelican case, I personally wouldn't. It's too clunky, it's too heavy, and it's a little bit overkill.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Last question, and then we will wrap it up. This one from Dondi. Early on, when you were speaking of when you were talking about referring to focusing on the eyes and shallow depth of field and use of rule of thirds, were you saying to use the smallest? Was it f-stop or aperture?
Yeah, great question. So f-stop and aperture are kind of interchangeable. Aperture refers to the opening that your f-stop controls. So for a shallow depth of field, I recommend the smallest f number. And I'm not going to go too much into this because the way, like the nomenclature around it is actually very backwards. Like a big aperture, a big opening is a small number. Those both do shallow depth of field. So when I'm explaining this, I stick to just one terminology, small f number, like f2.8, f4. When you start to get to f5.6 and bigger, like higher numbers, that's when you get the wider depth of field. So usually f2.8, f3, f4, that's my shallow, that's my portrait setting. And then f8 is my landscape setting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. All right. Well, I'm going to stop there and turn it to you for closing comments.
Well, thanks so much, Lee, and thanks so much for everyone. Great questions, awesome questions, and thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. Whether you're headed to Africa or your own backyard, a lot of these rules and a lot of these things are very transferable to any sort of photography, to travel, to landscape, to portraiture, to even kids' soccer games with fast-moving animals. There's a lot of lessons to be had with all photography. But again, I hope you are headed to Africa at some point, because it's certainly the trip of a lifetime for anybody that's interested in photography. So enjoy. Thanks.
My thanks as well, and we will get the replay out to all of you. You'll have it by about this time tomorrow, so do be on the lookout for that. And consider maybe coming and being with us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. Tomorrow is going to be a lot of fun. We are going to try to convince you of who the best bear in the world might be, and so this will be a fun topic. So with that, we'll say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.